Yep. This one is going to be a dilly. So the intro I actually wrote for an essay. I wrote like if these words even work together, exegesis overview of the works of Marx, just to kind of, go through his story, go through, his words, his project. Not so much focusing on one book. I mean, it's traveling through the books and just encountering Marx and trying to understand Marx through the words of Marx. But I felt, because of the way that I had written this about the etymology of the word commodity, it's actually very relevant in the schematic of Heidegger's thinking. So grab your beers or your coffees or your steering wheel or whatever you're doing, and join me now for chapter 13, The Materialist Unmasking of Marx. So welcome back to the Heidegger Destruktion series. And let's talk about, to begin with, commodity. The word commodity, it must have began as a whisper of thought, a kernel of human intention buried in a root so ancient that no tongue now speaks it. Med, which means to take appropriate measures, to measure, not the crude calculation of ledgers, but the careful, patient act of bringing something into the right relation. A farmer gauging the fall of rain, a healer, apportioning herbs, a builder finding the fit of stone to stone. From this quiet source, the word began its long migration, a journey that would see it shapeshift through empires, cross oceans, and ultimately come to describe the very stuff of our global bloodstream. In Rome, the root put on the armor of Latin and emerged as commodus, a word that hummed with harmony. It was an adjective of approval, signifying something proper, fit, convenient. A commodus home wasn't a mansion, but a dwelling that suited your needs. A commodus tunic was cut to the measure of your own shoulders. It was an intimate idea, a pact between a person and the thing that served them. From this grew the noun commoditas, a state of grace, the sweet fitness of a place, an adaptation so seamless it felt like a benefit personally conferred by the universe. There was no market here, no price. A thing's commoditas was its gift, not its cost. When the word slipped into Old French, it crossed what we could call a threshold. Commodite. Commodite retained the perfume of advantage and amenity, but a new, harder edge began to glint in its meaning. A commodite was a benefit, yes, but also a profit. It was the convenience of a well-placed well, but also the tangible yield of a harvest. The word had begun to attach itself to objects, to the physical things that made life not just fitting, but prosperous. It was no longer just a quality. It was edging toward the countable. Middle English welcomed it as commodity, and here the transformation accelerated. By the early 1400s, the word's abstract soul had become incarnate. It no longer just named the feeling of convenience, it named the goods of convenience themselves. A bolt of wool, a basket of grain, a tool that saved a day of labor. These were commodities. The word had fallen from its Platonic heaven of pure suitably and landed with a thud of oak on cobblestones in the marketplace. It had become a thing you could stack, ship, and then sell. Today, that journey reaches its apotheosis in the modern commodity, a raw material so thoroughly stripped of biography that its origins vanish. A barrel of crude oil from the Saudi desert is fungible with one from the North Sea. A bushel of hard red winter wheat from Kansas is a perfect interchangeable twin to any other. The market doesn't care who grew it, mined it, or dreamed it into being. The deep ancient question of fitness, does this suit my need? That question has been swapped for the cold calculus of the exchange. Is this identical to the next? The very name that once celebrated a tailor's perfect fit now describes a word of absolute anonymity, where price alone is the measure. The business mind shudders at this fate. For a company to have your product called a commodity is a quiet tragedy. It means your microchip, your medicine, your humble USB cable has lost its soul. Now it is undifferentiated, a ghost in a generic shell. It's only bought not because of the story you told about it, not because of the quality, but because it was the cheapest on the shelf. The word that once meant a personal benefit has come to signify a race to the bottom, a world of vanishing margins where brand uniqueness withers on the vine. Karl Marx saw a different ghost in the machine. For him, a commodity was not just a dead thing, but a crystallized relationship. Every good or service exchanged on the market was a vessel for human labor, possessing a dual life, a use value, the quiet, sensible purpose a thing serves, and an exchange value, the quantitative, abstract power it wields in the dance of trade. The wooden table, he might say, remains a thing you can touch and write upon, but as a commodity, it becomes a sensuous thing that transcends sensuousness, a hieroglyph of social labor that stands on its head, a mystery made of feet and inches. Yet the world's oldest memory is tenacious. In our figurative speech, we still use commodity in a way that would make a Roman merchant nod in recognition. We speak of a rare commodity, not for something sold on a futures exchange, but for an abstract quality whose value is wholly personal. Patience is a rare commodity. Kindness is a precious commodity. Here the word circles back to its roots. A commodity in this reclaimed sense is not about interchangeability, but about fitness for the human spirit. It is a measure, again, of what is appropriate, convenient, and needful for a good life. The patient person has measured the rush of the world and found a different pace. The kind one has taken the appropriate measure of another's pain. So the word carries its entire odyssey within its syllables. It is at once an oil tanker and a gentle virtue, a barcode and a lip balm. Its journey from the primeval measure of fighting world to the roaring, anonymous pits of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange is the journey of value itself, a story of how we took a word for what suits us and turned it into a system for moving the mountains of the earth, while still in our quietest moments using it to name what we have so little of and need so much. And that's going to take us into the parable that we're going to start with, to bringing forth Heidegger's worldview on Marx. So I'm going to start with a story about a woodworker. And the woodworker whose grandfather had once been a cabinet maker in a small countryside town. The old man chose his timber by running his palm along the grain, joined dovetails with the chisel he had inherited from his own master. And when a cabinet was finished, he would sign his name lightly with a pencil on the back panel, not for a buyer, but because the thing had become, in some irreducible sense, part of his own life. It held the memory of the hours he had spent shaping it, the particular knot in the ash that he had worked around, the long winter light that fell across his bench as he oiled the surface. Now the grandson, he works in a factory that makes cabinets, but by the thousands. His job is to stand at a machine that cuts the groove for the back panel. He does not choose the wood. He does not see the finished cabinet. He has never even met the person who will install it in the kitchen, never mind, keep it in their own home. At the end of the day, he cannot tell the panels he has touched from the 10,000 others that slide past him on the belt. His activity has become an abstraction, a quantifiable motion, a unit of time purchased at an hourly rate. The cabinet has become a commodity, and so, in a sense, so has he. This is not a parable about the loss of craftsmanship. It is a parable about a transformation in the very nature of what it means for something to be, what it means to be a thing, a worker, a human being. And it is the world that Karl Marx set out to understand. We are tracing, in this part of our inquiry, the fate of humanism, the long-held conviction that the human being stands at the center of meaning, that our reason and our freedom are the measure of things. In the previous chapter, we watched Ernest Cassirer defend that conviction at Davos against the rising tide of philosophy that would displace the human being from the throne. But to understand how that throne became a trap, we traced a deeper lineage back to the High Middle Ages, when scholastic theology first defined God as the ultimate craftsman or manufacturer, the hairstiller of reality. Once this metaphysics of production was secularized and the divine watchmaker was removed, modern humanity simply stepped into the vacant role of the supreme calculator, transforming the entire material world into an inventory of products waiting to be mastered. Now we are here to take a deep look at Karl Marx, the thinker who, perhaps more radically than any other in the 19th century, dismantled the self-image of modern humanity by revealing the terrifying outcome of this hair-stellan trajectory. Marx recognized that when a society defines all of existence as production, the human being inevitably ceases to be the center of meaning and is reduced to a mere economic commodity, a disposable unit of labor processed on the assembly line. Even while he still ferociously believed that a redeemed humanity lay on the far side of this material catastrophe. Marx died in 1883, just as Nietzsche was writing his most famous works, and the two men could scarcely have been more temperamentally opposed. Nietzsche detested socialist ideas with a visceral contempt. He saw in them the resentful leveling of the weak, the last gasp of Christian morality dressed in secular economic garb. Yet beneath this mutual antagonism, they shared something structural, something that makes their convergence far more significant than their mere differences. Both understood that the inherited pictures of human dignity were no longer tenable. Both saw that the autonomous, rational, freely choosing individual celebrated by the Enlightenment was not a natural fact, but a historical construction, and a fragile one at that. For Marx, this construction was the ideological product of bourgeois economic relations. The illusion that isolated individual pre-existed society, when in fact society produced the individual. For Nietzsche, the sovereign subject was a grammatical fiction, a shadow cast by the structure of language, a decadent invention of Socratic rationalism and Christian resentment that had cut humanity off from its vital instincts. Both grasped that a vast transformation was underway in the conditions of human existence, and both believed that philosophy could not afford to look away, that the old answers were finished, and that the future would be decided by how humanity confronted this collapse. Marx's way of confronting it was to descend into the factories, the mills, the counting houses, and to ask what actually happens to a human being when the world is reorganized around the extraction of surplus value. To grasp what Marx did, we have to begin where he began, not with economics, but with the massive shadow of Hegel. Hegel had argued that history is driven by the Weltgeist, the world spirit. For Hegel, this spirit is not an ethereal ghost, but a rational unfolding process moving through stages of contradiction and resolution toward the ultimate realization of human freedom and self-consciousness. The crucial mechanism of this unfolding is what Hegel called Entäußerung. That's the externalization, and Enframing. That's the alienation. And again, forgive me for my German. I'm going to have to do this every time. I'm not even really sure why we podcasters even do this. Why are we saying these German words? I mean, I find myself doing it because, I've heard other people do it. I feel like it's like a matter of respect in a sort of way, but I mean, I'm butchering the words, and what matters is I'm speaking to an English audience that they understand the English. So I'm going to think about this going forward. I have a Kant series coming up. And I mean, he's got so many, like Hegel and anybody like Heidegger, Hegel, Kant. It's all German. What's a brother going to do, man? All right. So, the crucial mechanism, right, of this unfolding is what Hegel called the Entäußerung, the externalization, and Enframing, that's the alienation. The spirit in Hegel's account does not remain bottled up inside itself. It pours itself out, externalizes itself into nature, into history, into the material world of institutions, laws, and artifacts. It becomes alien to itself, confronting its own creations as though they were foreign, hostile powers. But this alienation is not a mistake. It is a necessary moment in spirit's self-education. By recognizing itself in the alien world, by coming to see that the apparently foreign is in fact its own product. Spirit returns to itself enriched, deepened, fully self-conscious. Every war, every revolution, every philosophical system is a necessary moment in the spiritual odyssey. Though it's basically like the autobiography of Geist, coming to know itself through the painful discipline of otherness. Marx fell under that gravity. As a young student and journalist in the 1830s and early 1840s, he was steeped in the Hegelian atmosphere. He moved among the young Hegelians, that circle of radical disciples who believed that the master's dialectical method could be turned against the conservative political and religious conclusions Hegel himself had drawn. But Marx soon came to believe that the entire Hegelian apparatus had gotten the fundamental question upside down. The engine of history is not a spiritual drama unfolding in the medium of ideas. In fact, the engine of history is material, the raw, physical, often brutal reality of how human beings produce their food, their shelter, their clothing, how they labor, who owns the tools of production, who controls the surplus, and how the relations between classes are organized around that control. In a famous passage from this afterword to the second German edition of Capital, Marx tells us that Hegel's dialectic was standing on its head and that it must be turned right side up again to discover the rational kernel within the mystical shell. That's a quote, by the way. Excuse me. I'm so bad at this. I'm so bad at not saying, quote and end quote. But yes, the rational kernel within the mystical shell. This was not a crude dismissal. It was a deliberate, structurally precise inversion. Marx retained the Hegelian conviction that history moves in stages driven by deep structural contradictions. The dialectic. But he replaced Hegel's world spirit with the concrete struggles of material life, and he retained the Hegelian structure of Entäußerung, externalization, and Enframing, alienation, but he transposed its subject. For Hegel, the subject was spirit. For Marx, the subject is the human being who labors. Human labor externalizes itself in the product. The worker pours his living time, his muscle, his imagination into an object. Under normal conditions, this object would be a confirmation of his humanity, a mirror in which he recognizes his own creative powers. But under the specific historical conditions of capitalism, the object is not a mirror. It is a theft. The product is snatched away by the capitalist, and it returns to confront the worker as an alien, hostile power, a commodity that dominates him, dictates his wages, and renders his own life a mere instrument of its production. The Hegelian odyssey of spirit has become the material nightmare of the proletariat. This inversion matters. Let me say that again. This inversion matters enormously for our story because it sets up a confrontation that no one at the time could have anticipated. A collision between Marx's analysis of industrial capitalism and a vocabulary that would not be invented until half a century after his death. But before we trace that collision, we must go deeper into the logic of the commodity itself, because it is there in the structure of the commodity form that Marx's most profound philosophical insights lie. The commodity, Marx tells us in the opening pages of Capital, is a sensuous, supersensible thing. It has a dual nature. On one hand, every commodity has a use value. It is good for something. A coat keeps you warm. A loaf of bread satisfies hunger. This use value is qualitative, concrete, tied to the specific physical properties of the object. You cannot compare the warmth of a coat with the nourishment of bread. They're incommensurable goods and good for you, each answering to a different human need. But on the other hand, every commodity has an exchange value. It can be traded for other commodities in specific proportions. One coat equals 20 loaves of bread equals 1 ounce of gold. In the act of exchange, the coat and the bread and the gold are rendered equivalent. And to be rendered equivalent, they're concrete, qualitative differences. They must be systematically ignored. Exchange value is the realm of the purely quantitative. It abstracts from all sensuous particularity and reduces the diverse wealth of the human world to a single homogeneous substance, abstract human labor measured in units of time. This is a universal solvent that Marx identified, and it dissolves far more than economic categories. When the commodity form becomes the dominant principle of social organization, the entire world of human experience is transformed. A medieval cathedral and a sack of potatoes can both be exchanged for money. And in that exchange, their fundamental difference, the sacred architecture of a community's faith versus a perishable root vegetable, is rendered invisible. The qualitative texture of the world, its depth, its singularity, its claim upon our attention is flattened into a single monotonous dimension of price. Everything that is solid melts into air. But Marx's most brilliant and unsettling insight goes further still. It is not simply that the commodity form abstracts from qualitative difference. It is that the commodity form inverts the relationship between human beings and their own products. This is the phenomenon Marx named commodity fetishism. And we must understand it precisely because it represents the exact point at which Marx's economic critique becomes an ontological one. The point at which he begins, without knowing it, to describe the same structural transformation that Heidegger would later name Gestell. In the famous section on fetishism from the first chapter of Capital, Marx writes, and I paraphrase him closely here, that a commodity appears at first glance to be a perfectly trivial thing, a simple object of use. But analysis shows that it is a very strange thing indeed, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. A table, Marx observes, it's made of wood. It remains an ordinary, sensible thing. But the moment it steps onto the market as a commodity, it is transformed. It stands on its head and evolves out of its wooden brain grotesque ideas far more wonderful than it were to begin dancing of its own accord. The table no longer appears as a product of human labor, a thing made by human hands for human use. It appears as an autonomous, self-moving entity whose value seems to inhere in the wood itself. as though the social relation between the producers had magically migrated into the object and now glowed there with an alien spectral life. What Marx is describing is not a false belief. It is a real structural inversion. The social character of human labor, the fact that human beings work together, that their labor is part of a vast collective enterprise, is not visible in the act of commodity exchange. All we see are things, coats, bread, gold, tables. And these things seem to relate to one another directly as objects, objects according to their own immanent laws of value. The relations between human beings appears relational between things. Human social life becomes a ghostly pageant of commodities, each endowed with a life of its own, while the actual producers, the workers who made everything, recede into the invisibility, mere appendages to the world of things. Now, listen to what Heidegger, a century later, would say about the standing reserve under modern technology. Heidegger argued, the world ceases to be a collection of independent objects, Gegenstand, things that stand over against us with their own integrity, their own being, their own claim upon our attention. And it is intended, instead flattened into a vast inventory of on-demand potential. The Rhine River in Germany, the Rhine River becomes a power station. The forest becomes board feet of timber. The human being becomes human resources. Everything is ordered, calculated, and optimized as raw material for a process that has no goal beyond its own intensification. And in this ordering, the things themselves withdraw. Their own being, their own way of standing in themselves is occluded. They become invisible. They show up only as resource, only as something available for use. The convergence is unmistakable. Marx's commodity, fetishism, and Heidegger's standing reserve they're not identical concepts. They arise from different philosophical frameworks with different accounts of origin and scope. Yes, we all know that, but they are structurally convergent. Both describe a world in which the qualitative specificity of things is subordinated to a logic of quantification and exchange. Both describe a world in which the products of human activity turn back to dominate their producers. Both describe a world in which the way things show up for us, their mode of presence, has been fundamentally altered by a social and metaphysical transformation. Marx saw this transformation as a regional phenomenon, specific to the capitalist mode of production, and therefore curable by revolution. Heidegger would later see it as an ontological condition, a mode of revealing that precedes and conditions capitalism, and would persist under any modern technological regime, socialist or otherwise. The question that will divide them, the question that haunts our entire destruction, is whether the abyss has an economic floor. But before we turn to that confrontation, we must follow Marx all the way into the abyss he uncovered, because his analysis does not stop at the commodity form. It extends to the human being, into nature itself. And the picture it paints is among the darkest in the history of philosophy. And I just want to give you a little bit of hint here when we're talking about the abyss. when we're talking about being and nothingness. Okay, so staying on track with Marx here. Under capitalism, Marx argued, the worker is not a person who happens to sell his time. He is reduced to a labor power, a quantifiable, replaceable resource that sits on a shelf, as it were, waiting for a capitalist to purchase and deploy it. Marx described this as the reserve army of labor, a permanent pool of unemployed and underemployed whose very existence drives down wages and disciplines the workforce. The worker is no longer a someone. He is a something, a factor of production, an asset to be optimized, or a liability to be shed. This is depending on the quarterly report. The labor market treats human beings exactly as the commodity market treats sacks of potatoes, as interchangeable units of value, subject to the same impersonal laws of supply and demand. Nature fares no better. Marx noted that capitalism treats the natural world, rivers, forests, fertile soil, mineral deposits, as a free gift. This is a free gift to capital. Nature has no price tag on someone extracts and sells it. And so its destruction costs nothing on the balance sheet. The mountain is not a mountain. It is a future supply of gravel. The forest is not an ecosystem. It is a standing timber. The soil is not the living skin of the earth. It is a factor of agricultural productivity. You can hear in this description the unmistakable pre-echo of Heidegger's standing reserve. Marx and Heidegger, separated by a century after describing the same nightmare, a world in which the intrinsic being of things is systematically obliterated by the logic of calculable availability. Where they diverge, and diverge completely, is on the one question of the cause and the cure. For Marx, the root cause is unequivocally economic, the private ownership of the means of production. It is capitalism as a specific historical system that generates alienation, commodification, and exploitation. The cure is therefore a revolutionary transformation of the economic base. Abolish private property. Place the means of production in the hands of the associated producers. Plan production rationally according to human need rather than profit. In this vision, technology itself is not the problem. Technology is essentially good. It eliminates scarcity and liberates humanity from the ancient curse of endless toil. The problem is only who controls the machines. Once the worker sees the means of production, technology can be redirected from the accumulation of capital to the flourishing of human beings. The woodworker's grandson, as you can recall in the parable from the beginning, the woodworker's grandson in a communist future would no longer stand at a machine cutting identical grooves into identical panels, completely alienated from the finished cabinet and from his own creative powers. He would participate in a rationally planned production process that serves genuine human needs, and his labor, though still industrial, would be an expression of his social humanity rather than a theft of it. For Heidegger, this solution misses the point entirely, and in missing the point, It perpetuates the very logic it claims to overthrow. The problem, Heidegger argues, is way deeper than economics. It is metaphysical. The reduction of the world to standing reserve is not caused by capitalism. It is caused by a fundamental shift in how human beings understand the meaning of being itself. And that is the shift that he calls Gestell, Enframing. And enframing is not a political or an economic system that can be overthrown by seizing the factories. It is a mode of revealing, a way the world shows up for us that precedes and conditions any particular economic arrangement. If you change who owns the machines, but you do not change the underlying logic that treats everything as a resource to be optimized, you have changed nothing of ultimate importance. You have merely installed a new management team over the same planetary power station. Heidegger put this point with unnerving directness in his 1946 letter on humanism. And we must listen to his words carefully because they represent the most sustained philosophical critique of Marx ever offered from within the tradition that we are tracing. Heidegger wrote that Marxism's understanding of history is superior to all other philosophies of history. No other contemporary philosophy, Heidegger judged, had taken the measure of modern humanity's alienation and homelessness with comparable seriousness. Marx, that Heidegger acknowledged, had been in the heart of the modern catastrophe in a way that Husserl and his phenomenological brilliance and Sartre and for all his talk of engagement, none of these had ever been where Marx had been. But then Heidegger immediately drew the limit. The materialist conception of history, he argued, remains determined by a specific interpretation of human being, an interpretation that stretches back through Hegel to the very origins of Western metaphysics. Marxism, Heidegger claimed, it determines the essence of the human being as homo faber, the animal that makes things, the being whose fundamental activity is labor. Its envisioned future, communism, is a world of unalienated production, not a world that has ever questioned production itself as the fundamental way of relating to reality. This is a staggering charge, and it is worth pausing to consider its full weight. Heidegger is not saying that Marx's critique of capitalism is wrong in its particulars. He is saying that Marx's critique, however radical it appears, remains internal to the metaphysical tradition that we have been excavating throughout these lectures. The tradition that extends from Plato through Aquinas, through Hegel. That tradition has always, in one way or another, understood being as presence, as something that can be represented, calculated, and brought under human control. And it has always, in one way or another, understood the human being as the entity that does this bringing, as the rational animal, the image of God, the transcendental subject, or the productive laborer. By defining the human essence as labor, and by making the transformation of the relations of production the key to human liberation, Marx actually extends the logic of mastery rather than breaking with it. He offers a new master for the household of beings, not an exit from the household itself. We can feel the full force of this argument if we look honestly at the world that we inhabit. The managerial, optimizing, data-driven logic of late capitalism does not disappear when the means of production are publicly owned. It migrates. State socialist economies of the 20th century were, in their own way, just as relentless in treating nature as a resource and human beings as units of productive capacity. The Soviet Union's ecological record, the draining of the Aral Sea, the radiation of the steeps around Chernobyl, the poisoning of Lake Baikal, it is not an aberration from Marxist principles, but a manifestation of the deeper logic that Marx never questioned. The reduction of nature to raw material, of human beings to labor power, of the entire planet to a system of production. The problem, if Heidegger is right, is not the name of the title deed, but the framework that determines what a title deed means in the first place. And yet, we should not let this criticism obscure what Marx achieved. Marx named something that no philosopher had named with such clarity before him, that the concrete material conditions of life are not a mere backdrop to the human drama, but its very substance. That the way we produce our bread and our shelter shapes the most intimate recesses of our consciousness, and that the modern economic order generates a form of alienation so total that even the possibility of a meaningful relationship to the things we make and the world we inhabit is systematically foreclosed. The woodworker's grandson is not merely unhappy at his job. He is caught in a structure that renders him incapable of recognizing his own labor, his own world, his own being, and as his own. And Marx, more than any other 19th century thinker, gave that structure a name and a history. Heidegger collected from Marx that recognition. He saw in Marx's analysis of alienated labor something more than a political diagnosis. He saw the concrete historical form in which the forgetting of being manifests itself in the age of industry. When the worker is reduced to labor power, when the tree is reduced to timber, when the river is reduced to a potential hydropower source, the question of what it means to be, what it means for the tree to stand on its own being, for the worker to exist as something more than a function, this is not merely forgotten. It is actively obliterated by the very structure of everyday life. Marx gave Heidegger the material density of that obliteration, the smell of the factory and the weight of commodity. And Heidegger gave Marx's diagnosis a philosophical depth that Marx himself could not have articulated, or he just did not articulate, because the vocabulary for it, the vocabulary did not exist. Marx believed that this obliteration could be reversed by revolution. Heidegger believed that only a transformation in our very way of thinking, a turn, a keer, away from the will to mastery and toward a releasement that lets things be. That could be the only way to open a path beyond it. Both men saw the abyss. Only one of them thought the abyss had an economic floor. What then do we take away from this encounter as we press forward to the next chapter of our story? We take the recognition that humanism, the idea that the human subject is the source and center of meaning, cannot survive Marx's critique unchanged. Marx showed with a concreteness that no previous thinker had mustered that the autonomous, free, self-creating individual celebrated by bourgeois philosophy is in fact the product of specific, contingent, and oppressive material conditions. The human, at the heart of humanism, turns out to be a historical construction built on the backs of exploited labor and the systematic degradation of the natural world. But we also take Heidegger's unsettling question. Is Marx's solution itself a more profound extension of the same humanism? Does the vision of humanity that seizes the means of production and rationality, masters its own destiny, still imagine the human being as the Lord of beings rather than the shepherd of being? And if so, what would it mean to think beyond that vision? Not to abandon the critique of exploitation, but to radicalize it to the point where it questions not just who controls production, but the very meaning of producing it all. The question will follow us directly into the next chapter, where we will encounter the thinker who attempted, in the cafes and lecture halls of mid-20th century Paris, to build a new humanism on the ruins of the old, a humanism of radical freedom, of existence without essence. Jean-Paul Sartre read Marx, and he read Heidegger, and he believed he could fuse them into a philosophy that would place the full weight of responsibility on the individual's choice. His famous declaration that existence precedes essence, that we are thrown into the world without a fixed nature, and that we must create ourselves through our free acts. This was intended as the ultimate vindication of human dignity in a godless universe. But Heidegger's response to Sartre would be swift, devastating, and philosophically consequential in ways that reshaped the entire European conversation. For Heidegger, Sartre's existentialism was not an overcoming of metaphysics, but its final, most extreme expression, a humanism that had merely inverted the old hierarchy without ever questioning the privilege of the human subject. That confrontation will occupy us in what follows. And then beyond Sartre, we will have to turn back, further back than Marx, further back than Hegel, further back than the very structures of thinking that made capitalism as its critique possible. We will have to listen for a beginning so old that it predates the metaphysical tradition altogether. The world of Anaximander, Parmenides, and Heraclitus, for whom being was not a resource to be managed, not a product to be produced, but a mystery to be inhabited, a clearing that opens and closes, a fire that kindles and extinguishes and measures. but a path. That path must be prepared carefully. We have first to understand the last, most articulate effort to salvage the human center before it finally gives way. And that will bring us to chapter 14, Being and Sartre. So as we leave Marx, we can think about Heidegger's question here. Does changing who owns the machines change anything if the logic of mastery remains? Sartre walked directly into that question without realizing that it was a trap. So if we want to understand the friction that really broke apart the post-war intellectual world, we must place ourselves in Paris on October 29th, 1945. Jean-Paul Sartre delivered his legendary public lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism. And we're going to call this part the Paris Café Illusion. Sartre's goal was to make philosophy urgent, street level, and alive. He famously summarized his entire worldview into a phrase that could fit on a cafe napkin. Existence precedes essence. For centuries, traditional Western metaphysics and theology had maintained the exact opposite. The classical tradition argued that essence precedes existence, meaning that human beings possess a predetermined nature about them, an inherent blueprint designed by God or carved out by cosmic reason. And our life's purpose is to conform to that static nature. Sartre executed a brilliant, seemingly radical inversion. He declared that there is no God, there is no cosmic blueprint, and there is no fixed human nature. We are born first, we exist blank and unwritten, and only afterward, through our own agonizing freedom and the choices we make, do we forge our own essence. In these words of Jean-Paul Sartre, quote, "Man is nothing else but that which he makes of himself," end quote. It is a heady, intoxicating vision of absolute autonomy. But when this lecture reached Martin Heidegger in his remote mountain cabin in Teutonic, he did not see a breakthrough at all. He saw a catastrophic betrayal. Sartre believed he had, somehow complicated or destroyed, shattered Plato's chains and escaped the cave of traditional metaphysics. In reality, by simply reversing the classical formula, by taking essence precedes existence and flipping it into existence precedes essence, Sartre kept the exact same conceptual architecture intact. As Richard Polt observes in his study, Heidegger, an Introduction, a reversal of a metaphysical statement remains a metaphysical statement. It does not break free of the framework that it inverts, but merely delivers a mirror image of the same structure. This distinction between essence and existence, the very terms in which the debate is conducted, this goes unquestioned. Sartre's existentialism did not overcome the metaphysical tradition. It gave that tradition a new human-centered face, while leaving its deepest presuppositions untouched. The stakes here are not just academic, they are deeply ontological. By centering everything on the human subject's radical capacity to choose, Sartre inadvertently turned the human being into the absolute dictator of reality. If meaning only exists because a human subject willfully projects it onto a valueless world, then we are right back to treating existence as a giant battery of, customizable potential. Sartre's radical freedom becomes the psychological engine for the very calculating technological mindset that seeks to dominate the earth. Now, I'm going to move on here to a transition, something that's a little bit interesting, something that might surprise you. I'm going to talk about the lost in translation disaster. And one has to wonder, like, how did such a massive split or, fracture occur between two thinkers who seem to be speaking the same language? And if we're going to uncover this, the root of this misunderstanding, we have to examine a structural disaster that occurred in translation, a linguistic distortion that warped the philosophy before the ink was even dry. When a partial translation of Being in Time appeared in French in 1938, the translator Henry Corbin, he faced an impossible task. Heidegger's central term, Dasein, is not a name for a thing. In German, it literally means their being, or, I guess we invert that in English, being there. It does not refer to an isolated ego. By the way, the reason why I say that, because da is basically like German for like the, there kind of thing. And sein is being, Dasein, right? So it's, if we literally translate it, it's their being, but in the expressive context, it's being there. So again, it doesn't refer to an isolated ego or a detached mind or a conscious subject peering out at an external world. Dasein names the open region in which reality shows up at all. This is a type of clearing where beings become intelligible, the there that any genuine thinking must inhabit. It is a word designed to get us out of the subject-object picture altogether. Remember, Dasein is in the world, right? Like through the world. That's what it is. So like Dasein is the activity of having the problem of being. Corbin, working in a French philosophical culture still saturated with Cartesian assumptions, he rendered Dasein as réalité humaine, which is a human reality. And I totally butchered the French, so I'm going to leave that be. All second languages I'm going to butcher. I'm an English-speaking person. I am not apologizing ever again. Okay. That single choice, right, of rendering Dasein as human reality, that single choice, it detonated a half a century of misunderstanding. The moment you say human reality, you have dragged the conversation back inside the human skull. You imply that reality is something dependent on human consciousness, something we possess or project. Sartre read Being in Time through this distorted lens and concluded it was a treatise on human psychology and a radical personal willpower, a kind of existentialist self-help manual avant la lettre. He completely missed that the book was never an investigation into human freedom. It was an inquiry into the meaning of being itself, an attempt to ask a question that human-centered thinking had systematically forgotten how to ask. Heidegger addressed this directly in the letter on humanism, written to Jean Beffret in 1946. Okay? His correction is surgically precise. He writes, and I quote closely, that Dasein is a word, it doesn't name the being of man. Rather, it names that which first makes possible the relation to being. And that's the there. The there is not where the ego stands. It is the open region of truth itself, the clearing in which anything can presence at all. Sartre could not see this because his philosophical formation remained stubbornly tied to the conscious, the conscious willing subject of Descartes. He was attempting to build a philosophy of absolute human mastery on the foundation of a text that was trying to teach humanity how to quiet its will and listen to something that it does not come from us. And we're going to have to talk now more about Heidegger's turn and the shepherd. And we must ask ourselves here where we go once, where do we go once we realize that human willpower cannot solve our civilizational crisis? Imagine a community that notices its local river is drying up due to industrial pollution. The community's instinctual response is to build more dams, engineer massive water filtration plants, and deploy advanced technology to fix the crisis. But they soon realize their frantic fixing is just consuming more energy and causing more pollution. The tools they are using to solve the problem are born from the exact same mindset that caused the river to dry up in the first place. This realization is precisely what sparked the mid-career pivot known in literature as the turn, the Die Kehr. Heidegger looked at the post-war as existentialist craze and the explosion of modern technology and realized a terrifying truth. We cannot escape the loop of endless calculation and total mobilization by making more radical existential choices or exercising more willpower. That is simply pouring fuel on the fire of the will to power. So through this turn, the entire philosophical project shifts away from the human subject, away from doing, striving, and conquering. In the letter on humanism, written as a direct response to Beaufray's question about how to restore human dignity, Heidegger delivers his most famous alternative framework. He declares that, quote, man is not the Lord of beings. Man is the shepherd of being, close quote. We have already encountered this figure of the shepherd in our reading of Marx and Heidegger's critique. Now we see why Heidegger reached for it precisely in response to Sartre. Consider the profound difference in those two identities. A lord who owns the land, he draws boundaries, exploits the resources, and demands that the estate yield a profit. A shepherd, on the other hand, does not create the mountains. He does not engineer the grass. He does not manufacture the flock. He is given a landscape to care for, to protect, and to watch over. He listens to the seasons and steps back to let the environment thrive on its own terms. To say we must become shepherds is to argue for a radical psychological pivot. We must abandon the illusion that our freedom is defined by our capacity to constantly customize and manipulate the cosmos. To survive the modern age, we must learn the quiet art of letting things be, stepping back from the aggressive drive to unlock the world as raw potential, and instead opening ourselves to a reality that speaks on its own terms. Yet the shepherd's quiet art was not the only alternative offered in the ruins of the post-war world. While Sartre insisted that we are condemned to be free and must invent meaning through sheer decision, another existentialist voice had already been speaking of a different kind of confrontation with the void. Karl Jaspers, the psychiatrist turned philosopher, did not see the human condition as a project of self-creation. He saw it as a series of boundary situations, death, suffering, guilt, that these things that shatter the illusion of the autonomous ego and open a space for what he called the encompassing. Jaspers, too, he believed he was carrying forward the unfinished project of being in time. He, too, would be sharply rejected by Heidegger, for despite its talk of transcendence, Jaspers' philosophy remained a psychology of the subject, the self facing its limits, longing for a wholeness it can never possess. The orbit of the eye had been widened, but never broken. So we must examine this second great misreading, a misreading that, alongside Sartre's, would cement the public image of existentialism while burying the question of being deeper still. And so we arrive at chapter 15. Karl Jaspers, The Psychology of Worldviews and the Final Illusion. The Quiet Psychiatrist. In 1919, a year after the guns fell silent across Europe, a reserved, asthma-stricken psychiatrist in Heidelberg published a book that would become one of the secret wellsprings of existential thought. Karl Jaspers was 40 years old. He had trained in medicine, worked in a psychiatric clinic, and grown increasingly convinced that the dominant methods of his field, the neat diagnostic categories, the laboratory measurements of reaction times, the reduction of mental suffering to brain physiology, these all missed the living human being entirely. His book, in English, reads Psychology of World Views. This was his attempt to map the inner landscapes of the psyche, not as a set of illnesses to be cured, but as the fundamental structures through which a human life orients itself towards meaning, the limit, and the entirety, the whole. It was not a book of clinical psychiatry. It was a philosophy of existence disguised as psychology, and it struck the young Martin Heidegger like a lightning bolt. Heidegger read the book immediately. He was 30, still unknown, working as an unsalaried lecturer in Freiburg, and he wrote a long, dense, ambivalent review of Jaspers' work, a review that would not be published in his lifetime, but that already contained in embryo the entire fracture that would later split the existentialist movement. Heidegger recognized in Jaspers a mind that had been broken free of the academic convention, a thinker who was asking the real questions. What does it mean to be a self? What happens when our taken for granted frameworks collapse? Yet Heidegger's judgment was also surgical. Jaspers, he wrote, had described the limit situations that bring the self to its utmost possibility, but he had done so entirely within the horizon of the I. The question of being, the sense in which the world, that the self are at all, like the fact that they exist, this remained untouched. Jaspers had written a brilliant psychology of the subject, but he had not asked what it means for the subject to be. This initial unspoken verdict would define everything. Over the next decade, Jaspers and Heidegger became friends and intellectual allies. They corresponded warmly. They visited each other. They shared a sense of that philosophical tradition, needed to be shaken to its foundations. When Being and Time appeared in 1927, Jaspers received it with admiration and genuine, bafflement. He wrote to Heidegger that the book was a work of extraordinary power, but that he could not quite grasp what it was after, that it seemed to circle around something he could not name. Heidegger replied that Jaspers had understood nothing. The friendship cooled. And then after 1933, politics drove them definitively apart. Karl Jaspers' wife was Jewish, and Jaspers, he refused any compromise with the Nazi regime. And Heidegger, well, we all know he was a Nazi. The philosophical divergence matters far more than the biographical undoings. For our purposes, our destruction of humanism, Jaspers represents the second great pillar of what the public came to call existentialism, and the second systematic misreading of what Heidegger had tried to do. If Sartre turned Being and Time into a doctrine of radical human freedom, Jaspers turned it into a psychology of personal worldviews. He took Heidegger's analytic of Dasein, the painstaking description of what it means to be the being that asks about, this totality of being. Remember the stage, right? The beings are on the stage of the capital B being. So we asked that question, and, this description of what it means to be the being that asks about being, and recast it as a typology of existential attitudes. He replaced the question of being with the question of the self's authenticity in the face of limit. And in doing so, he remained, as surely as Sartre, imprisoned within the vocabulary of the Cartesian subject. So let's talk about worldviews and walls here. To understand Jaspers, we have to understand the word Weltanschauung, and it translates literally as worldview. But the English term is too cognitive, it's too intellectual. A worldview for Jaspers is not a set of propositions you hold in your head. It is a total lived orientation, a shell, a shelter, a framework that holds existence together for you. It is the way the world feels solid under your feet, the unspoken assumptions about what matters and why. Every human being lives inside some worldview, whether they articulate it or not. The rationalist lives inside the conviction that the universe can be grasped by clear and distinct ideas. The romantic lives inside the conviction that authentic life wells up from feeling and intuition. The aesthetic lives inside a framework of renunciation. The hedonist inside a framework of pleasure. Worldviews are psychic houses, and most of us spend our lives decorating the interior, never stepping outside to examine the foundations. Jaspers' Psychology of Worldviews, that book, was an attempt to survey these houses from the outside. It classified the types of worldviews, traced their psychological origins, and laid them out like specimens in a museum. But the museum itself, Jaspers argued, that museum is a delusion. The classifying mind, the detached observer who compares worldviews as though standing above them, is itself housed in a worldview. There is no neutral platform from which to survey human existence. The moment you think you have risen above all perspectives to achieve a universal point of view, you have merely adopted the perspective of rationalist detachment. This was Jaspers' first great insight, and it is a genuine one. Objectivity about the whole is impossible because the whole includes the one who is trying to be objective. But if no worldview can claim final authority, then what holds humans' existence together? Jaspers' answer was that worldviews, they shatter. And it is in the shattering, not in the comfortable inhabitation, but in the shattering that something like truth appears. He called these shattering events limit situations. So these are limit situations. They are the moments when the protective shell of the worldview cracks upon the open and the raw. The unprocessed reality of existence breaks through. Jaspers identified 4 fundamental limit situations: death, suffering, struggle, and guilt. These are not problems to be solved. They are walls you cannot go around. You will die. You will suffer. You will be entangled in conflict with others. And you will be burdened by responsibility for actions whose full consequences you cannot know. No philosophy, no religion, no technology can remove these walls. They are the absolute boundary of what it means to be a finite embodied self. So what happens when you hit such a wall? According to Jaspers, the ordinary, taken for granted self, that, the one we're not really thinking about, the self that manages its daily affairs, pursues its goals, identifies with its social roles, this self collapses. You can no longer pretend that your worldview is a safe house. You stand exposed. And in that exposure, Jaspers argued, something else becomes possible. The shell self cracks, and through the cracks, a deeper mode of being he called extends can emerge. I guess it would be like as extends, existens. This is the pivotal term in Jaspers' mature philosophy. And we must handle this carefully. Existens is not existence in the ordinary sense of just being there. It is not the brute fact that you are alive. As extends or existens is the potential for authentic selfhood that awakens precisely when the limited objective self encounters its own boundaries. The objective self knows itself as an object among objects, a body, a profession, it's a set of measurable traits. Existence knows itself only as a freedom that can never be objectified, a possibility that can never be captured in a definition. When Jaspers wrote that existence is not a state but a task, he meant that existence is something you must become, and you can only become it by passing through the crisis of limit. This vision had an enormous appeal. It offered a way to take suffering seriously, to find meaning in the shattering experiences that the modern therapeutic culture was beginning to medicate away. It spoke to a generation that lived through the trenches, the economic collapse, the breakdown of inherited, certainties. Jaspers gave them a language for the darkness that was not despair, but awakening. And because he had been formed in the same intellectual atmosphere as Heidegger, the phenomenology of Husserl, the existential intensity of Kierkegaard, the historical sweep of Dilthey, it was easy to assume that his extends was simply another name for what Heidegger called Dasein, and it it was not. And the difference is the difference between psychology and fundamental ontology. The encompassing horizon. Jaspers was not content to describe the psychology of limit situations. He recognized a deeper problem. If existence, awakens at the boundary, what lies beyond the boundary? What is it that the limit situation opens to? His answer was one of the most haunting concepts in the 20th century philosophy. Das Umgreifende. Let me try that again. Das Umgreifende. The encompassing. The encompassing is not a thing. It is not a god in the traditional sense, though Jaspers would later call his philosophy of, this philosophical faith that points towards transcendence. It is not the universe as an object of scientific study. It is the horizon within which all objects and all subjects appear, but which can never itself become an object. Whenever we try to grasp encompassing directly, we turn it into something finite, something inside the horizon. And the true encompassing recedes. It withdraws, as Heidegger would say. It is what is always surrounds us, sustains us, and eludes us. In Jasper's own formulation, the encompassing is that which always only announces itself in what is objectively present and in the horizons, but never becomes an object. You can hear the echoes of mysticism here, of Meister Eckhart's ground of the soul, of the Kabbalistic Ein Sof, of Neoplatonic One. Jaspers was deliberately drawing on these traditions, but he was translating them into a modern philosophical idiom. He wanted to speak to a world that had lost its traditional faith without losing the dimension of transcendence. The encompassing was his way of naming the space that opens all worldviews, and when they're all shattered. Not a new belief system to replace the old one, but the open horizon within which belief and unbelief alike become possible. And this is where the divergence from Heidegger becomes, I would say, absolute. For Jaspers, the encompassing is assessed through the subject's own existential transformation. It is the limit situation that cracks the subject open, and the subject, in its shattered openness, becomes aware of the horizon that surrounds it. The movement is always from the subject outward. As extends, the authentic self is the receiver of transcendence. The encompassing is the gift that arrives when the self has been hollowed out by suffering. For Heidegger, this entire configuration remains trapped within the subject-object relation, precisely the metaphysical structure he had been trying to dismantle since being in time. Jaspers, as extends, may not be a Cartesian ego thinking clear and distinct ideas, but it is still a subject, a center of experience, a self that undergoes transformation, an I that encounters limits and opens to the beyond. And the encompassing, for all its apophatic, mystery, it is still conceived as the correlate of that transformed self, the other side of the limit, the horizon that answers the subject's deepest need. The structure is still one of a subject standing before something that transcends it. The question of being, the question of what it means for anything to be at all, including the subject, including the encompassing. This question is not asked. Heidegger's most explicit critique of Jaspers appears in a note appended to the letter on humanism. It is worth quoting at length because it gathers together everything we have been tracing. Quote, Jasper still determines the essence of transcendence from the basic experience of the existence which, according to him, is the proper ground of philosophizing. But existence is here always only the subjectivity of the subject, even if it is conceived as the existence of the individual in communication and in the historical situation. The question of being, as such, remains outside Jasper's thinking. Indeed, it is explicitly rejected as philosophy of being. Close quote. The charge is precise. Jaspers, Heidegger argues, takes the human subject's experience of limit and transcendence and the starting point and the measure. The encompassing is not a name for being. It is a name for what the self experiences as the beyond of its own finitude. The whole inquiry moves within the orbit of the I. However far that orbit, has been stretched by crisis and inwardness. Jasper's philosophy is, in the end, a profound psychology of the self's relation to the unknowable. But it is not an ontology. It does not ask what being itself is, how it gives itself, how it withdraws, how the open clearing in which the self and the encompassing both appear it's constituted in the first place. This is the same verdict Heidegger delivered against Sartre, and it is no accident that the two verdicts are structurally identical. Sartre's radical freedom and Jasper's boundary situations are mirror images of one another. Sartre's subject is the heroic projector of meaning, refusing any given essence, creating value through pure decision in a meaningless cosmos. Jasper's subject is the fragile recipient of transcendence, stripped of its illusions by suffering, opening itself to the encompassing that cannot be grasped. One is active and the other receptive. One shouts, the other listens, but both are still subjects. Both begin with the human being, center the human being, and interpret everything else, the world, other people, the divine, in terms of the human being's situation, freedom, or need. What neither Sartre nor Jaspers could do was step outside the modern subject-object framework that has governed Western thinking since Descartes. That framework assumes that the world is composed of two things, of things, subjects, which are conscious, free, and meaning bestowing, and objects, which are inert, determined, and meaning receiving. You can glorify the subject, make it the absolute creator of value, as Sartre did, or you can humble it, make it the anguished recipient of transcendence, as Jaspers did. But you have not questioned the framework itself. You have only rearranged the furniture inside the prison. And this is precisely what Heidegger meant when he insisted that his own thinking was not as existentialism. Being in time is not a description of the human condition and its finitude and anxiety. It is an attempt to ask the question that both Sartre and Jaspers presuppose without ever asking. What does it mean to be? Before we can talk about the subject's freedom or the subject's limit situations, we have to understand the clearing, the open space of intelligibility, in which anything like a subject or an object, a world, a limit, or a transcendence can even show up at all. That clearing is not generated by the human being. It is not a projection of consciousness. It is the gift of being itself, the there that is given to us and that we are. Dasein names the entity that stands in that clearing and has to take over the question of its own being. It does not name a subject confronting a world. It names the open place where world and self arise together. Jaspers came closer to this insight than Sartre did. His sense that all worldviews are finite shells, that objectivity is an illusion, and that the true cannot be grasped but only approached through the shattering of our certainties. All of this breathes an atmosphere that Heidegger would recognize. Jaspers even used language that sounds at times like a philosopher of being, the encompassing at that which can never be objectified, the call to listen rather than to master. But the decisive step was never taken. Jaspers always circled back to the self, to the transformation of the subject, to the psychological and spiritual drama of the individual soul in search of meaning. The question of being remained, for him, a philosophy of being. Something abstract. This philosophy of being was something abstract, scholastic, detached from the lived urgency of the limit situation. He could not see that the limit situation itself is only possible because being has already granted a clearing in which something can be encountered as limiting. And this brings us to the theological dimension of the dead end. Sartre represents total humanist closure against the divine. Jasper leaves a space open for the encompassing and a quasi-theological leap when faced with extreme suffering. Heidegger rejects both. Sartre is too arrogantly humanist, and Jaspers is too reliant on a vague psychological transcendence. We can now see why the transcendence Jaspers offers is vague, and why its vagueness is not a sign of mystical depth, but a philosophical exhaustion. The encompassing is not God, because God would not be an object of belief, and Jaspers insists that the encompassing is not an object. But it is not being either, because being in Heidegger's sense is not a horizon that answers to human need. It is the event of disclosure that lets all needs, all horizons, all gods be encountered in the first place. Jaspers' encompassing is, in truth, a psychological function. It is the name for the space that opens when the subject's worldviews collapse. The felt beyond that ensures that shattering is not meaningless. It is transcendence as experienced by the finite self, transcendence for us. But transcendence is such, transcendence that is not a correlate of the subject's experience. It remains unthought. And so Jaspers, for all his talk of the encompassing, never escapes the horizon of the modern subject. He provides a way for the post-religious soul to continue to speak of the sacred without committing to any particular revelation or dogma. It is a philosophy that makes transcendence safe for the secular intellectual, a way to honor the depth of suffering without submitting to the authority of a church. But precisely because it is tailored to the needs of the modern subject, it cannot be the rupture that breaks the subject open from the outside. It is, in the end, a sublime project, the last, most elegant shape the humanist eye can take before it finally, in the next step of our story, dissolves altogether. The two pillars and the doorway. Sartre and Jaspers, taken together, define the horizon of what the 20th century called existentialism. Sartre, the atheist, humanist, placed the burden of meaning-making on the individual's free choice. Jaspers, the psychologist of transcendence, placed it on the individual's capacity to open to the encompassing through suffering. Both centered the human subject as the primary locus of philosophical inquiry. Both read Heidegger and believed they were continuing his work. Both were wrong. And we are to believe that Heidegger's repudiation of both were not, matters of personal, conflict or philosophical rivalry. It was the drawing of a fundamental line. So long as thinking remains within the subject-object framework, whether it exalts the subject as a creator or humbles it as recipient, it repeats the deepest gesture of the metaphysical tradition, the reduction of being to something that stands before the human being and cannot be represented, manipulated, or appealed to. The shepherd, remember, it does not stand before the flock as a subject before objects. The shepherd dwells in the openness of the mountain, letting the flock be, answering to a call that does not come from the self. Neither Sartre's or heroic projector nor Jaspers' anguished limit dweller is a shepherd. They are still each in their own way lords of their respective domains. Sartre's domain a desolate freedom, Jaspers' domain a trembling threshold to the beyond. Why does this matter for our larger deconstruction series here? And that's because the doorway we are seeking, the doorway out of the human-centered universe, it cannot be found by intensifying the subject's experience. Whether through freedom or through suffering, it can only be found by stepping back into a way of thinking that predates the very distinction between subject and object. We have to go back before Descartes, before Aquinas, before Plato, back to a language in which the world had not yet been divided into an inner and outer, and truth had not yet been reduced to correctness. The language is the language of the Pre-Socratics. And so the next step in our path will not be another engagement with modern existentialism. It will be a deliberate leap across the entire history of metaphysics into the first beginning of Western thought. The world of Anaximander, Parmenides, and Heraclitus. There, decay will be a moral category. It will be the seamless jointure by which beings are held in their limits and given their place in the whole. Their physis will not be a blind material process. It will be the emergent blossoming of presence itself. There, aletheia will not be a property of propositions. It will only be the unconcealment that brings shine forth in their being. Only when we have learned to hear that the primordial language, a language that speaks of being as event, not as product, will we be ready to walk the path of fundamental ontology without mistaking it for a psychology of the self. The humanist illusion has been dismantled piece by piece. Marx showed that the autonomous individual is a product of material history. Sartre tried to rebuild human dignity on the foundation of radical freedom, and the foundation collapsed into a more subtle form of mastery. Jaspers tried to open a window onto transcendence through the shattering of the self, and the window turned out to be a mirror reflecting the self's own deepest needs. The time has come to leave the prison altogether. But to do that, we must go back to a moment before the prison was built, to the original clearing where the question of being first broke open, and where it was heard for a brief, dazzling moment without the interference of the eye. And this is going to bring us now to the Pre-Socratics, the first being and the question of being. Musicians. Musicians are such a great way to talk about this, like artists, musicians, people that reach this kind of flow state. So I'm going to ask you to imagine a musician who, after years of studying the orchestral tradition, the sonata forms, the symphonic structures, the harmonic resolutions, they discover a collection of folk songs so old that no one remembers who composed them. These songs are not written in any notation system. They have no key signatures, no time signatures, no indication of tempo or dynamics. They're just melodies handed down through oral tradition, each generation adding its own inflections, its own ornaments, its own subtle distortions. And yet, when the musician listens carefully, they hear something that the entire orchestral tradition has covered over. And this is the raw encounter with sound itself, the voice emerging from silence, this internal that is not yet a harmony because it has not yet been rationalized into a system. The musician realizes with something like awe that the folk songs do not represent a primitive stage that the symphony transcended. They represent an experience of music that the symphony, for all of its grandeur, can never recover. An experience that was not a stage, but a beginning. This is something like what Heidegger found when he turned in the 1930s and 1940s to the pre-Socratic philosophers, the world of Anaximander, Parmenides, and Heraclitus. These thinkers, he argued, had experience of being that was not yet covered over by the metaphysical tradition that Plato and Aristotle, for all their genius, but that they had already begun to construct. Their language, the Greek language in which they thought, this language still preserved traces of an original encounter. The Pre-Socratics were, for Heidegger, the first beginning, the moment when Western philosophy touched something it would spend the next 2.5 millennia forgetting, translating, and systematically burying. Heidegger's engagement with the Pre-Socratics was not an antiquarian interest. It was the most strategically crucial move in his entire project of the deconstruction of ontology. If the metaphysical tradition had gone wrong, if it had systematically reduced being to presence, to substance, to the object of a subject, then the question was not simply how to correct this tradition from within. The question was how to recover the experience of being that the tradition had covered over. And this required a return to the origin, not as a nostalgic retreat, but as a deliberate spiral, a going back that is simultaneously a going forward, a recovery that transforms what it recovers. Heidegger's reading of Parmenides focuses on the famous fragment, "Tugar autonoin istin tike ene." Quote, "For the same is thinking as well as being," close quote. Traditional scholarship has read this as a logical identity claim. Thinking and being are the same because thought necessarily corresponds to reality. But Heidegger argues in his 1942-43 lectures course on Parmenides published as volume 54 in the grand works of Heidegger, Gesamtausgabe, something like that anyways. You can look it up online, Gesamtausgabe. Have fun. Let's go back here. Traditional scholarship has read that this is a logical identity claim, okay? But Heidegger talks about in his lecture course that it misses the phenomenological dimension entirely. Parmenides is not offering a proposition about the logical structure of thought. He is describing the event of unconcealment itself, the way in which being shows itself to thinking, the way in which thinking belongs to the self-disclosure of being. The goddess who speaks in Parmenides' poem is not a mythological figure, but the voice of aletheia itself. Aletheia, the claim that being makes upon those who are willing to listen rather than to dominate. Being makes upon those who are willing to listen rather than to dominate. This reading is radical, and it has been contested. The classical scholar Alexander Morlietos, in his 1970 study, The Route of Parmenides, he argued that Heidegger's interpretation projects onto Parmenides a phenomenological vocabulary that the ancient text cannot support. And there is force in this objection. Heidegger is not doing classical scholarship in any conventional sense. He is reading Parmenides as if Parmenides were a participant in the philosophical conversation that Heidegger himself is trying to initiate. A conversation about being that has been interpreted for 2,000 years. Whether this is legitimate hermeneutics or creative violence is a question that every reader of Heidegger must decide. What is certain is that Heidegger's Parmenides is not the Parmenides of the textbooks. He is a thinker who experienced being as an event of disclosure, who understood that thinking is not our activity, but our belonging to the self, showing of what is. Heidegger's reading of Heraclitus is equally transformative. Where traditional scholarship sees Heraclitus as the philosopher of perpetual flux, that's the panta everything flows. Heidegger argues in the 1943 essay Aletheia, and in the 1966-67 seminar, published as volume 15 of the Gesamtausgabe, that's the Heidegger's, his collected works, that this reading captures only the surface of Heraclitus' thought. The deeper teaching concerns the logos. Not logic in the modern sense, not the laws of rational thought, but the gathering together that lets things show up in their belonging together. The logos. Heidegger argues in the event of disclosure itself, the way in which being gathers beings into their presence while simultaneously holding itself back in concealment. Heraclitus' fragment, physis cryptesthe philhe, nature loves to hide, is not a complaint about the difficulty of knowledge. It is an ontological insight of the first order. Being reveals itself precisely in its withdrawal. It shows itself at that which never shows itself completely. And I just want to take a short break here to talk about the German language in just a little bit. So I've been studying Lacan for a little while here, and one of the things that Lacan noticed is that when Freud was anglicized, they stripped all the meaning that he was giving to the words that in English we turn into like ego or the id and these kind of words, but they're stripped of the sensual, the sensualness of what it is to be an ego. It's such a dry, mechanical word. Or when Freud was saying these things in German, it had all of this properties of like this sensuality of the ego, this feeling of the ego, not just this kind of descriptive mechanical word. So maybe that's what's going on here with Heidegger as well. And when he's going deep into these Greek thinkers, because Heidegger did think that the German and ancient Greek language were very compatible. All right, so the most ambitious of Heidegger's pre-Socratic engagements is his 1946 essay, The Anaximander Fragment, which takes as its point of departure the single surviving saying of the earliest Western philosophy. Quote, "Whence things have their coming to be, there too they must have their passing away, according to necessity. For things must pay penalty and retribution to one another for their injustice, according to the ordinance of time." Close quote. Traditional scholarship has read this as a proto-scientific claim about natural cycles, birth and death, creation and destruction, governed by a cosmic law of compensation. But Heidegger reads it as a meditation on the justice of being itself. The central term is decay, spelled like dike, usually translated as justice. For Heidegger, interpreting an Anaximander, decay is not about right and wrong in a moral sense. It is about the very structure of existence. Decay names the seamless joint, the way beings are fitted together and held in their proper place within the whole of what is. It is the ordering by which being grants each thing its presence, while at the same time containing it, giving its limits and preventing it from overflowing its bounds. The opposite is adikia, injustice. This is not a moral failing, but an ontological tendency. The drive of any particular being to overstep its limits, to push itself forward in a way that ignores its connecting to everything else. Adikia is the refusal of the mutual belonging that holds all things in a balanced, measured arrangement. The fragment of Anaximander says that things must pay retribution to one another for their injustice. Heidegger understands this to mean that being itself preserves its truth precisely by restraining the arrogance of beings. It calls them back from their overreaching, drawing them again into the jointure, the fitting together of the whole where each thing receives its due limits in its place. In this way, the order of existence is continuously restored. What Heidegger collected from the Pre-Socratics was nothing less than a vision of philosophy before it became metaphysics. He collected the conviction that the Western tradition had began with an experience of being that was richer, more mysterious, and more primordial than anything the subsequent tradition could articulate. He collected the insight that the Greek language, physis as self-emerging emergence, aletheia as unconcealment, logos as gathering disclosure, decay as ontological jointure. These preserve traces of their original experience that a certain kind of reading, patient and poetic, can recover. And he collected a model of philosophy, not as system building or argument constructing, but as listening, a receptive attunement to the voice of being. But Heidegger was also acutely aware of the danger of nostalgia. The first beginning cannot simply be recovered as if we could return to ancient Greece and start over. As he argued in the Contributions to Philosophy between 1936 and 38, the first beginning can only be repeated, and repetition in Heidegger's sense is never a return to the identical, but always a transformation. The task is not to go back to the Greeks, but to go forward through them, to take up their question so fundamentally that the questioning itself becomes renewed. This is what Heidegger calls the other being, not a second start alongside the first, but a new start that is possible only because the first beginning has exhausted itself in the completion of metaphysics that we traced through Nietzsche. The takeaway from the Pre-Socratics then is this: the first beginning of Western philosophy was an experience of being as the event of unconcealment, as physis, aletheia, logos, dike, that the metaphysical tradition, beginning with Plato and Aristotle, systematically translated into the vocabulary presence, substance, and correctness. Heidegger's return to the Pre-Socratics is not scholarly antiquarianism, but strategic necessity to recover the question that metaphysics forgot. But the recovery is not a return. It is a repetition that transforms. And this transformation requires something that the Pre-Socratics themselves did not possess: a fundamental ontology that has worked through the entire metaphysical tradition and emerged, hardened, and tested on the other side. The fundamental ontology is being and time. The work where everything Heidegger had collected from all the thinkers we have explored converges into a single systematic attempt to reopen the question of being. We have circled around this work throughout our entire journey. We have seen its concepts emerge in Heidegger's engagement with Husserl and Aristotle, with Kierkegaard and Augustine, with Kant and Schelling. Now we must enter it directly, not as a textbook to be summarized, but as a path to be walked.